Well, I am very pleased to be part of this endeavor, and on behalf of my colleagues, Michael Halpern and Katie O'Keefe, wanted to share with you some results from our meta-review of the cancer health economics literature. We undertook this meta-literature review as part of our initial gap analysis and to start assembling resource materials for this conference planning effort. Michael has just shared his analysis of the portfolio of currently funded research from NCI to address the sort of what is being done now. And in this presentation, I'm going to share some of our analyses related to what we already know based on relatively recent literature that has been reviewed systematically. Ultimately, these pieces will be synthesized along with the tremendous input that we expect from this conference to identify gaps and next steps. In terms of potential topics, and for those of you who missed Michael's slide on the framework, this is the same slide. We ideally would have wanted to include a broad array of topic areas reflected here. We wanted to include reviews that examined economic inputs, as well as structural policy factors, and the variety of economic outcomes at the patient, payer, provider, system, and societal levels. So the criteria that we devised were broad in hopes of having good coverage, but while maintaining tractability. So we realized we couldn't tackle thousands and thousands of review articles. So our search criteria were set up for this purpose. Required mesh terms to be neoplasms and economics. It had to be an English language publication, and the category of publication had to be a systematic review. We also restricted to publications within the last 10 years. Each publication was reviewed by 2 of the 3 of us. Whenever possible, we relied on the abstract from PubMed. But when we needed to, we pulled up the entire publication and reviewed that. We applied additional inclusion and exclusion criteria, which I'll discuss more on the next slide. And finally, as we were reviewing these, we categorized the studies by economic study type, cancer type, phase of the cancer continuum, and the relevant population, and the nature of treatment or intervention. And I'll note that these assignments were not mutually exclusive, so that if a review covered multiple cancer types that were named, so it's a study of X in breast, colon, and lung cancer, we counted the particular review towards each of those. However, many of the reviews were what we call cross-cutting, meaning that they didn't specify a specific cancer and were likely relevant across a broader spectrum. For example, studies that looked at prevention and management of bone metastases and didn't really focus on a specific cancer type. In terms of our further inclusion and exclusion criteria, we then looked to see whether the content fit into one of 3 broad categories. So whether it focused on economic outcomes associated with cancer or cancer care, the economics of cancer healthcare delivery, who pays for care, how much is paid, who receives payment, how delivery is organized, and then methods used in cancer health economics. So some results. Our search process culled a total of 352 reviews, 164 met full study criteria, 17 reviews searched for but failed to find economic studies. And I should clarify that they were often studies that were looking at a broad range of sort of treatment patterns or outcomes associated with a particular intervention, and they were also looking for economic studies. And so they found articles examining, say, the treatment patterns and clinical outcomes, but not the economic piece. So we sort of held on to those because we felt they revealed some selected gaps in the literature. So in terms of what we found that the overwhelming majority, over 2/3 of the reviews focused on cost effectiveness or cost utility analysis, followed by cost of care studies. So there were relatively few studies that focused on other categories. Most of the reviews, again, over 2/3, focused on the treatment phase of the cancer continuum, followed by much smaller percentages focusing on screening and then survivorship and end of life. In terms of the type of cancer, the plurality of studies were cross-cutting in that they focused on some intervention that cut across multiple cancer types, but did not have any specific cancers mentioned in the study review. This was followed by breast and colorectal cancer. Surprisingly, the frequency by cancer site going below colorectal really did not necessarily reflect disease incidence or prevalence. This is a snapshot of the sort of topical areas for individual reviews. As you can see, they do cover the spectrum. Lots of focus on screening techniques and procedures. Diagnostics were focused principally on advanced imaging and other kinds of imaging-related diagnostics. Treatment focused on systemic therapy for the most part. And then in terms of survivorship, there was really a sort of scattershot of topical areas. So in summary, the reviews identified reflect a strong focus on cost and cost effectiveness analysis of the economic outcomes. Very few reviews were focused on policy, provider organization, payment, or response to incentives. Over 2/3 of our reviews focused on the cancer treatment phase of the continuum, with less than a sixth focusing on screening or survivorship, and smaller proportions on the other topical areas, the other continuum areas. And the focus commonly cuts across multiple cancers, examining treatment of interventions not specific to an individual cancer site, as I mentioned, the example of management of bone metastases. And otherwise, a little over 20% of reviews focused on breast cancer. So just some thoughts about lit reviews, and anyone who knows my work knows that I'm not a lit review person generally. So this was a nice opportunity to reach outside my comfort zone. The Medline search that we did was fairly general. And so we may have missed some content areas that didn't use the specific mesh headings of neoplasm and economics. This might include topical areas that are not specific to cancer, but affect a broader group of individuals with health shocks or chronic health conditions, such as access to medications, specialty drugs, employment impacts, palliative care. So these topics may be broader than cancer, and if a particular review didn't specifically limit to articles focusing on cancer, we may not have captured it. We may also have missed some articles that focused on economics, on cancer, but didn't have an economics designation. And so we recognize that there are some limitations to what we've done. I think that the next steps, though, instead of trying to patch together this broad meta review and fill in all of the gaps, would be to really focus on more targeted searches with specific topic areas noted. And here we invite contributions and support from the research community and we will be involved in pursuing some of these as well. Literature reviews in general have inherent limitations for purposes of this type of gap analysis. So not only do they not capture ongoing research, they're actually very backward looking in the sense that we identified reviews in the past 10 years, but they may have reviewed articles that were published 10 years before that. So they're really very backward looking, and I think the portfolio analysis can be much more useful. The review topics that are reflected are also not selected systematically. Reviews tend to be done when a research group is starting a new project and needs to know what the state of the art is. Funders may direct some of these reviews processes, and those are often device or pharmaceutical industries, perhaps explaining the results where we have a lot of cost effectiveness and a lot of treatment focused reviews. And as a result, literature reviews may overlook topical areas where there really is an extensive literature, but it may not be a focus of interest for the review process. So with that, I will thank you, and again, thank you for participating in this conference.